This is going to be the main takeaway from this video. Take a screenshot so you don't forget. It's going to be the most devastating of what should be a lot of useful material, and all will become clear as things progress. This video is about World Health Organization recommendations, of which the one you just saw was one, regarding non-medical interventions in the event of a pandemic, written in 2019, very recently, where the infectious disease in question was one we're all very familiar with, as in one flew over the cuckoo's nest, or the boy who flew, and others such. And I'm looking at the extent to which these recommendations could be applied to more recent events, shall we say. I make liberal use of the names of the two infectious diseases in question in the video, and it occurred to me looking at it afterwards that this might cause the YouTube algorithm, to say nothing of the Bill Gates conspiracy crackpots on the other side, to think I was somehow implying that the one is the other, which I'm certainly not doing. Still no taste or smell after 3 months, by the way. So rather than just upload the whole thing to Rumble and then put one of those silly pointer videos on YouTube, click on the link in the description to see the full video on Rumble, what I've done is gone back into the video and bleeped out the 20 or 25 or so references to the two infectious diseases in question. So most mentions of this thing here, to say nothing of this thing here, are bleeped out. This is mildly confusing, it sounds plain weird, and it does have an unfortunate comedic effect, which I really hope most people can get past. I hope the majority of vaguely intelligent people watching this can get past the desire to go, bloop, bloop, bloop. Yeah, no flies on you, eh, matey? I mean, even without this brief explanation, I think it would be clear enough. But I think with me laying it out like this, it should be an absolute walk in the park. And I will do some summarising at the end, at which point the bleeps are well into history. Back in 2011, the UK government issued a pandemic preparedness strategy that I've looked at in previous videos. The World Health Organization has been engaged in something similar, considering non-pharmaceutical public health measures for mitigating the risk and impact of epidemic and pandemic. And much more recently, this was produced in 2019, though I don't know the exact date. It would be worth knocking the obvious objections to its applicability to on the head first. Differences like greater lethality, worse side effects, like loss of taste and smell, 3 months and counting, welcome to my world. These don't relate to transmission, which is what these non-pharmaceutical public health measures are all about mitigating. So we need a difference relevant to that, transmission, otherwise you could simply delete and replace it with because the content would be applicable to both equally. How about asymptomatic transmission? Playing devil's advocate here, cannot be transmitted asymptomatically and can be, and therefore any interventions tailored towards cannot be assumed to be applicable to. The first lockdowns in Europe happened towards the beginning of March 2020, and the first whiffs of asymptomatic transmission were only a month or so before that. Study documents first case of coronavirus spread by a person showing no symptoms. That would be this one here on the 30th of January 2020. Asymptomatic transmission was just too unknown at the point of the first lockdowns to be doing anything on that basis. You'd need months of data gathering and case studying to be able to justify such draconian measures on the basis of something like asymptomatic transmission, and the two just occurred about a month apart, the first instances of it and the first lockdowns. However, that doesn't even matter, because this turned into this 5 days later. High-profile report on asymptomatic spread of coronavirus based on faulty information, health officials say. The patient wasn't asymptomatic, she was symptomatic and taking symptom-repressing drugs, and nobody thought to ask her. So realistically you can rule out the idea of asymptomatic transmission being such a key difference between the two as to make any recommendations inapplicable to, at least as they understood the novel virus at the time. So back then, in early 2020, pre all the lockdown madness, you could probably just as easily take the given title and amend it thus-wise. But, we're assuming here that asymptomatic transmission, if it's a thing, and it's a pretty big if, then that differentiates it from and the text here suggests otherwise. If we go to the summary page on page 19 and skip to the FMs that we're all glad to have seen the back of, take a look at this. FMs worn by asymptomatic people are conditionally recommended in severe epidemics or pandemics to reduce transmission in the community. This is for so it looks like that both infectious diseases, infectious diseases, are very similar in terms of transmission. Transmission both symptomatically and asymptomatically. So it's very hard to see why you couldn't read this as this just as well in terms of the applicability of the measures in the document. And also on a side-ish note, the FMs were clearly a good faith initiative without any Machiavellian undertones, because when these recommendations were written, it was all theoretical. There was no pandemic, so the recommendations were exclusively medically based. It's inconceivable that there was an ideological component. It's conceivable that maybe an ideological focus developed with the FMs subsequently, but at least at this point here in 2019 they were thinking of them as a purely medical intervention, and that undermines somewhat the idea that they became ideological subsequently. Now let's have a look at what they go on to say. Just that first bit again. FMs worn by asymptomatic people are conditionally recommended in severe epidemics or pandemics to reduce transmission in the community. Then, although there is no evidence that this is effective in reducing transmission, there is mechanistic plausibility for the potential effectiveness of this measure. In other words, the recommendation isn't based on evidence simply because they don't have any, but rather on the nature of the blocking mechanism. It seems like they should work, logically. And remember, this is which is asymptomatic, so they're talking about identical means of transmission. But what about symptomatic? Because that would seem to make sense. If you've got and you're in a public place and you're coughing and sneezing and spreading it, then a mask would seem to at least be logical then on that basis. A disposable surgical mask is recommended to be worn at all times by symptomatic individuals when in contact with other individuals. Yes, that does seem to make sense. But hang on here. Although there is no evidence that this is effective in reducing transmission, there is mechanistic plausibility for the potential effectiveness of this measure. Same thing. It's one thing to lack evidence about asymptomatic transmission, but they don't even have evidence for symptomatic transmission. Quality of evidence asymptomatic, moderate, lack of effectiveness in reducing transmission. Quality of evidence symptomatic, moderate, lack of effectiveness in reducing transmission. Both symptomatic and asymptomatic. No, you see, you can get asymptomatically, and this is a key difference. Sorry, both transmit in the same ways according to the World Health Organization, as you would expect for infectious diseases, and no utility for FMs in either scenario. A tad more detail further down. Overall result of evidence on FMs. 10 randomized control trials were included in the meta-analysis, and there was no evidence that FMs are effective in reducing transmission of laboratory-confirmed. Quality of evidence. There is a moderate overall quality of evidence that FMs do not have a substantial effect on transmission of. Recommendation. FMs worn by asymptomatic people are conditionally recommended in severe epidemics or pandemics to reduce transmission in the community. Disposable surgical Ms are recommended to be worn at all times by symptomatic individuals when in contact with other individuals. Although there is no evidence that this is effective in reducing transmission, there is mechanistic plausibility for the potential effectiveness of this measure. The two are transmitted largely in identical manner, mainly by people with symptoms, occasionally by people without symptoms. There is no evidence that the cloth reduces transmission. Or to put it another way, which is basically the same way, there is no evidence that this is effective in reducing transmission, says the World Health Organization. I think the point is made, and I will move on. Contact tracing. Contact tracing is tracing people who have been in contact with an infected individual. All those mobile phone pings and that mechanism of leaving your details at a cafe or a pub or anything, that was all contact tracing. How much money was spent on all of that? Quality of evidence. There is a very low overall quality of evidence that contact tracing has an unknown effect on the transmission of. Recommendation. Active contact tracing is not recommended in general because there is no obvious rationale for it in most member states. Population: individuals who have come into contact with an infected person. Overall strength of recommendation: not recommended. There is no obvious rationale in most member states. Right, having someone quarantine themselves on the basis of a cell phone notification that they had been in the vicinity of another cell phone whose owner may have been infected is irrational. What a shock. Well, at least it was irrational up to 2019, not 2020. Isolation of sick individuals. This is an area where non-pharmaceutical interventions might actually start to become logical. Though, oddly, we discover there is a very low overall quality of evidence that isolation of sick individuals has a substantial effect on transmission of except in closed settings. Recommendation: voluntary isolation at home of sick individuals with uncomplicated illness is recommended during all epidemics and pandemics, with the exception of the individuals who need to seek medical attention. The duration of isolation depends on the severity of illness, usually 5 to 7 days, until major symptoms disappear. If you are ill, you voluntarily stay at home in a pandemic for as long as your symptoms last, probably not more than a week. If you are ill. This was 2019, not decades before, not necessarily even months before, maybe just weeks before. The next one goes back a notch, but it's pretty key. Quarantine of exposed individuals, which they define as imposed separation or restriction of movement of persons who are exposed, who may or may not be infected but are not ill, and who may become infectious to others. This is about as close as we get to the demented lockdowns of 2020, but we're still a step ahead because these are people who are well but who might have been exposed to illness. Quality of evidence. There is a very low overall quality of evidence that quarantine of exposed individuals has an effect on transmission of. Remember, also transmits asymptomatically. Read that bit again. There is a very low overall quality of evidence that quarantine of exposed individuals has an effect on transmission of. The studies identified in the review reported or predicted variable effectiveness. Recommendation: home quarantine of exposed individuals to reduce transmission is not recommended because there is no obvious rationale for this measure, and there would be considerable difficulties in implementing it. Population: people who have had contact with infected cases. If you've been in contact with an infected person in a pandemic, not just seasonal but a pandemic situation, home quarantine is not recommended because, shall we have a drum roll here? There is no obvious rationale for this measure. Again, transmission is identical. They also talk about school closures and travel restrictions, but there's nothing particularly startling in any of that. Oh, and did I mention that they don't recommend home quarantine for exposed individuals because there is no obvious rationale for this measure? Did I mention that? So, to summarize all of this. FMs. 10 randomized control trials were included in the meta-analysis, and there was no evidence that FMs are effective in reducing transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza. Contact tracing. Active contact tracing is not recommended in general because there is no obvious rationale for it in most member states. Quarantine of the sick. Voluntary isolation at home of sick individuals is recommended. The duration of isolation depends on the severity of illness, usually 5 to 7 days, until major symptoms disappear. Quarantine of people exposed to the sick. Home quarantine of exposed individuals to reduce transmission is not recommended because there is no obvious rationale for this measure. And they took all that and turned it upside down a few short months later for another infectious disease which largely transmits in the same way. FMs, compulsory. Contact tracing, compulsory. Quarantine of the sick, compulsory. Quarantine of people exposed to the sick, compulsory. Quarantine of every individual in the land, regardless of health status, compulsory. If you are exposed to infection, there is no rationale for quarantine. That is the biggest takeaway from this video. I said at the beginning, take a screenshot. Did you do that? A year later, compulsory quarantine. Not just for the exposed or the potentially exposed, but for everyone. And they'll do it again. How can you be sure they'll do it again? Well, I'm not sure that they will, but there are some pretty good pointers out there. Next, COVID. New disease X could arrive in Britain any day as expert warns of signs of major outbreak on the horizon. So no fear porn there. I mean, monkeypox was never going anywhere with all the potential jokes. I've had monkeypox, but I was asymptomatic. That was never going anywhere. Disease X sounds so much better. And in the event, they will do it again. All of that, they will do all of that again. Not because they'll want to, because they'll know that the reality is that, but because to not do it again would be to admit to being wrong in the first place, and that would be intolerable. And you know that's the case. How many of the Bill Gates vaccine genocide depopulation of the planet crew, shall we call them, have recanted that position? How many? Let's count. 0. Well, let's leave it there. Absolutely none, obviously, because the ego will collapse with the removal of one little brick. The entire house of cards falls apart. And it's the same on both sides. The difference being that those folks have no power and these folks have all the power. So they will do it again because they absolutely will not be able to admit to being wrong. And the public will follow along like lemmings, exactly the same as the first time. So I highly recommend, now that you understand the context of the screenshot that I put on at the beginning of the video, I highly recommend that you share this around with a link to the original document, which I will put in the description. And just in case you have forgotten the context, I've laid it all out briefly here. I'll leave the whole thing on the screen at the end. And don't forget to like the video. Yes, I know you did like this video because it confirmed the biases and prejudices of the echo chamber, and it doesn't challenge those biases and prejudices in any way. So I figure I'm not controlled opposition paid for by Pfizer, today at least. Maybe I'll go back to being that after the next video, if that one does challenge the biases and the prejudices of the echo chamber. Who knows? Anyway, make good use of this, I suggest.